Right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our last meeting of the year. Hope you all have good holiday plans. If you didn't check the email I sent yesterday, we have decided to not meet the day after Christmas or the day after New Year's. So we'll be back here on January 9th.
Wow.
Yeah, lots of time off. It's gonna be weird to not see you all. Right, we have a couple of guests today. We have Sue Schlone here in the house. She lives here in Williston and is checking out Rotary for the first time. And then up on the computer, we have Janet Smith, and she contacted me on the email and asked if she could have the Zoom link. So welcome, Janet. And with that,
Jerry's back.
oh, Jerry's back. I don't even consider you a guest anymore, Jerry, but welcome back. You're just part of us now, right? Yeah, okay. And I will let Debbie introduce our speaker in a few minutes, but first we're gonna have Vince give our Rotary Minute.
Thank you, Liz. So the Rotary Minute today is going to be on the meeting that we just went to, a couple of us went to, which was at UVM on polio. And it was really good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of polio a bit, just so everybody has a refresher. I think most people know the most exciting part is the new things that are going on with some new vaccines. So at the meeting, there was about 12 Rotary members. They were from different clubs, the Burlington Club, Shelburne Club, our club. Kelly Drew, the district governor, was there. Eric Deneau, who's the end polio coordinator, was there. Charlie McGill, our assistant district governor, was there. Lisa and I went, and Susan, and there was about 8 different UVM vaccine center investigators. They're all doctors, including the UVM research, Dr. Kate Tracy. There was 3 from the WHO, which is the World Health Organization. They came from Geneva, and they're pretty actually top-notch people. And the one was Dr. Andrej Mach. He is actually the head of polio research. And then Dr. Harish Verma, who is the medical officer. I will say, if you ever have a chance, if they do it again, this was, I think, the first time they did it. If you ever have a chance, go to it. It was really interesting. We had a lot of conversation. I'm going to try to boil it down as quick as possible. If anybody wants to really talk about it, you could probably catch Susan, myself, Lisa, or Charlie after the meeting. So just highlights, people know of it. Polio is an infectious disease, mostly affecting children, attacks the nervous system, causes paralysis, spinal and respiratory paralysis, and death. Polio existed since prehistoric times. They've showed kids with canes in Egyptian times. It was first diagnosed as a clinical description in Britain in 1789, and it was then formally recognized in Germany in about 1840. It affected people around the globe for millennia, and in the mid 20th century, the wild polio virus could be found all over the world and killed and paralyzed people. There was no cure and no epidemics on the rise, and there was an urgent need for a vaccine. And the polio basically is transmitted by water, so you have to actually ingest it. What we started to talk about at the meeting first, they also described the 2 vaccines. Most people know them. I'll go real quick. The first is IPV, which is injectable polio virus. That was the first, came out in 1955. It was a dead polio virus that they were injecting. It was excellent on paralysis. And the cases at that time, which was that epidemic number, went from about 58,000 to, in about a 7-year period, went down to 61 in the United States. So tremendous. Most of us living in that time probably got that kind of shot. Then it came out with the OPV, which was oral. And the oral was different in 2 ways. One, it was able to, so it was actually a low-cost version of the injectable. So then they were able to put it on sugar cubes and get it everywhere. And that one actually used the live virus. It was also excellent on paralysis. So that's how they started some of the mass campaigns, especially in the United States. And then, you know, the oral, the OPV, helped eliminate polio from the US in 1979, and then the Western Hemisphere in 1991. In our part, in 1979, Rotary International started a multi-year project to immunize 6 million children in the Philippines, which was really the start to actually try to, you know, get rid of it globally. In '88, the World Health Organization, they passed a resolution to eradicate polio to achieve permanent reduction to zero with no risk of reintroduction. And in the same year, global polio initiative was launched. During that same time, around that time when the WHO kind of took over as the initiative, what they started to do is they always measured polio by a metric of paralysis. So if there was no more paralysis, there was no polio. But what they didn't recognize at the time was that transmissibility was actually still high. And that was a new metric that they added. And it was kind of an important metric because what they could find was, even though you don't have any paralysis, you don't have any more cases, transmissibility can last 30 years. So people still have it in their bodies, in their intestines, and they're still shedding this, and it still can get into waterways. So, you know, if you had the vaccine like in the United States, we were kind of safe, but again, it was still spreading. So what they also recognized during that time was with the original one, the IPV, injectable. It's excellent in paralysis, but it's not actually good at ending transmissibility. But the oral has excellent on paralysis and transmissibility. So I think everything's good. So I'm just going to say where we are today, and then I'll talk about the new virus and the new vaccine and why it's needed. So today, only 2 countries have it: Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's the wild polio virus, which is the original that's been around forever. And really, we're not able to get to the children in that area and or adults in that area, because adults can still have it or get it if they never got vaccinated. Basically because the warlords in those particular areas are stopping people from coming in and actually administrating it. So that's kind of a sad thing that we can't eradicate it because people want to just keep their territory and in a sense propagating it. So in Pakistan, there's about 28 cases. In Afghanistan, there's 23 cases in this year. So it's still very small, but we've been talking about eradicating it for so long. You know, it's like over 99% globally of the wild polio is gone. But these, you know, it's been 3 years, and it may be another 3 to 5 years before we can kind of make some breakthroughs. So what they found in about 2010, which is how UVM is also starting to get involved in this. The oral had one drawback, and that it was able to be mutated. So even though it wasn't spreading wild anymore, the mutatable ones was spreading all over Africa. And the mutatable ones still give paralysis and death. So they were not, so you can't give the same vaccine to the mutatable virus. So it is now kind of mutated in a whole different way. At that time, so it's basically Africa and the Middle East. So during that time, research on what's called the NOPV2, so oral, strain 2, because there's actually 3 strains, to finish the clinical studies. For more than a decade, they were going down the safer alternative. They secured approval last November to begin distributing this more stable and less likely mutatable vaccine. Tens of millions of doses have been distributed. So it's actually helping the 2, but there's actually strain 1 and strain 3 that is not being attacked at this point. So they have to, so during that time, and how UVM is now involved is, there has been still clinical studies going on to create a vaccine that will attack 1 and 3 of the mutatable versions, and that's where UVM comes in. The university's vaccine testing centers launched trials for 1 and 3 through global efforts by the Bill and Melissa Gates Foundation. It's one of the 3 studies in the United States. The other 2 is in Dartmouth and University of North Carolina. There are no plans to launch this new vaccine for 1 and 3 because it's still in clinical trials. But the potential development estimates is going to be that it should be complete about 2025, 2026. And then potentially they're going to look at rolling it out, getting some regulations. So
I'm just curious if there was any discussion about the potential. I'm wondering if there was any discussion about the potential ramifications of a change in our Department of Health and Human Services. Okay.
So-
Get into this morning.
yeah. So this is the only question I'm going to answer because this is supposed to be a Rotary minute.
Yeah.
I'm not speaker for today. So, yeah, I know, but polio is important, so we extended it. Yeah, I think there are concerns. Obviously, there was conflicting information that who they might put ahead of it might actually disqualify it, try to get it off the market. I think after Mitch McConnell came out and said he was a polio survivor and said nobody's going to win if they take that stance, they've rolled it back in the last couple of days. So it doesn't mean that you still can't change it in the future if elected. I'm gonna.
It's not a question. Did you mention that? They mentioned that the total Rotary contribution to this effort was $3 billion worldwide.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for the update. That sounds like it was quite an event. Right, so we have one more visitor today. Faith Leach has returned for her second visit. Thanks for being here again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie to introduce our speaker.
Hey, everybody. So we're fortunate to have Steph Yu from the Public Assets Institute with us today. Steph came to Vermont and to the Institute in 2015, and she became the executive director in 2023. She is glad to be back here in New England. She has roots in New England after stints in the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and on the West Coast. Her fiscal experience in the public and private sectors in multiple states informs her work at Public Assets, and I'll let her tell you more about what the group does. And we're fortunate to get a sneak preview of one of their major reports that they release every year of the State of Working Vermont. Steph has also had staff time in the AmeriCorps program, and she's worked in state budget offices and state legislatures, and she currently lives in Burlington with her spouse and 2 kids. So please help me welcome Steph Yu.
I'm here for dry throat, so I'm gonna keep my water here. Good morning, thank you for having me. Is this all working, all the technology? Okay. Yeah, okay. Housing, dignified work, education, food, social security, and a healthy environment. These are the promises we've made to each other in statute. Vermont law requires that our spending and revenue policies address these needs. I think we're closer on keeping some of these promises than others, but we know that Vermonters are struggling in all these areas. We know some of what works, and we have the resources to keep these promises, but we have to think differently, I think, about what makes life affordable and government's role in that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Public Assets, we work at the state level to really try to improve the well-being of Vermonters through research and policy development. And every year we put out this report. When Debbie first invited me, I was so sure we'd have our report done by now, which we do not. But so you are getting a sneak preview. It's not yet final in public, but it will be the first week in January. It is fact checked, so that's the main thing. So you can count on these charts. But I want to share a few highlights from the report, and then happy to have time for questions. And I think it's sort of worth noting that from the point of view of a lot of sort of classic Vermont, classic economic indicators, Vermont and the US as a whole are doing pretty well, right? But these things can often sort of not tell us much about what people are actually experiencing in their daily lives. So we try to look more at how Vermonters are doing, and then I'll say a little bit about the state budget and where we sort of invest, what the state does to improve economic security for people here. But to sum up, what I would say the three main takeaways from this report, and they're not necessarily new compared to past reports, right? But sort of keep being true. The first thing is that for Vermonters who are struggling to afford their basic needs, it's both a cost problem and a wage problem, right? Both sides of the equation. And then the second thing is that as a state, I think Vermont has made a number of positive improvements for Vermonters' economic security in recent years. But then there's other areas where some of the policies that we have in place have sort of fallen behind where the need is. And then the third thing is that as a state, Vermont has the resources to keep these promises, and modest, reasonable investments would make a big difference in the bottom lines for a lot of Vermont families. So I'm going to go through, the report is in two sections, and I'm going to go through just a handful of charts. So this is just a sample. Again, when that report comes out in January, you can check out the whole thing. But I'm going to kind of take it, we sort of organized it by these promises, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them so you can kind of get the flavor for the sake of time. But like I say, there's plenty more. So on the topic of health, which we were just talking about, and I did appreciate that information. I thought it was really interesting. Also, my daughter would love your sweater. The cloths are all the rage right now. So there you go. But on the health side, I think we all have this sense that, there was sort of a leveling off of healthcare costs for a little bit, kind of between about, 2014 and maybe a couple of years ago. And then particularly in 2024, we're seeing another kind of big jump in healthcare costs. I think we've all heard about it with teachers' healthcare, but maybe you're experiencing it on the exchange or in other places. So this chart is looking at out-of-pocket healthcare costs after adjusting for inflation. So more than doubled in the last 20 years for pretty much across the board, all types of families. This is employer-based healthcare in particular. People are being asked to contribute more to their healthcare costs. And then I want to turn to housing, which again has been another kind of big topic over the last few years, particularly as we've been watching this sort of the expiration of the federal COVID funds for shelter and seeing a lot of Vermonters being exited from housing. So on the next slide, this is looking at the number of unhoused Vermonters. And so you can see it's more than tripled since before the pandemic, right? So we're up there. And I just want to point out, this is the point in time count from January. So most people have shelter in the winter. And then we put some of these limits in place. As a state, they put limits in place in July that led to a lot of people being exited from shelter in the fall, but then they can come back into shelter during the winter because our shelter policy prior to the pandemic has always sort of been this seasonal approach to it. So on the next slide, but I think what's important to note about sort of the big picture of the housing situation is that it's affecting Vermonters across the entire income spectrum, right? So on the next slide is the cost of a mortgage payment. So just in the last few years, right? You're looking at it jumping since 2021. This is for the median home price in Vermont, right? So $1,600 to more than $2,500, and you can see that red chunk is all interest, right? It's all the higher interest rates. I mean, there's a little bit of these other pieces, but the vast majority of the increase is based on the higher interest rates. But a lot of the housing units, a lot of the housing challenges on the next slide come down to lack of supply. Right, so this is sort of the summary of sort of what we've been building from 2013 to 2023, and then looking at what the projected demand is from 2025 to 2029. So you can see we're falling really short of where we need to be. And that first chunk, that bottom chunk in 2025 to 2029, that's just to make up kind of the backlog of where we are. And then the rest of it is sort of the new demand that we're seeing because we're seeing increased in migration. So you can see we're sort of well behind where we are, and unless we sort of accelerate the pace of building that housing, that housing supply problem gets worse. The next promise I want to talk about a little bit is dignified work. And I think this one maybe requires a little bit more definition in the sense that what does it mean to have dignified work, right? So we're focused primarily on the wage aspect of that work, that jobs would pay a livable wage and therefore sort of keep up with the cost of your basic needs over time. I think for a lot of people, when you think about dignified work, they'd probably add things like fair scheduling, overtime rules, fair tipping policies, all that kind of stuff into the dignified work. But when we're just looking at wages, essentially you can see, so this is the 10th percentile, the median wage, and then the 90th percentile. And pretty flat, and this is adjusted for inflation, so pretty flat for decades, right? But we have seen a little bit of growth just in the last couple of years, and higher growth, faster growth, right, for the lower wage jobs, which I'm sure sort of you've had that sense. And a lot of that, I think, has been driven by the demand for workers. So on the next slide, we're looking at the unemployment rates. And really, since the pandemic, I don't know if you can see that sort of faded gray part on the top there. That's the broader unemployment rate. The blue is sort of the standard unemployment rate. But you can see we've had these pretty low rates for a long time, one of the highest in the country. So that gray represents that sort of broader measure, which includes not just the people who are officially unemployed, which means they're actively looking for work, but the people that have given up looking for work, and the people who are considered underemployed, meaning that they wish they were working more hours than they are. So, you know, there's been a lot of demand for workers, a lot of that is driving up the wage growth, which is a good thing, but, you know, we still have many more jobs than we have people looking for work. The next promise I want to talk about is Social Security. So again, probably need some definition. I think most people think of the federal program when they hear that term Social Security, but I think what we meant by it in the statute is that it's really like, think of it as filling in the cracks left behind from these other programs that sort of have specific support for specific things like food, housing, healthcare, those kind of things. But depending on your situation, you might need sort of more flexible support. So we really kind of think of this as the backstop to make sure that you have a livable income no matter what your circumstances are. So part of what we look at is what programs leave people in poverty, and then also which groups are more likely to experience poverty. So as long as we've been tracking these numbers, and this is true both in Vermont and the country as a whole, there's racial disparities. Vermonters of color are much more likely to experience poverty. But we also looked at poverty by age. And a lot of this report is really sort of comparing pre-pandemic baseline to where we are now. You know, there was a lot of sort of disruption during the pandemic, and I think we're finally at a place where we're kind of able to see what we would say is kind of a before and after. And so the biggest thing is that you see that big jump in the poverty rate for people 65 and older. And again, that pattern is true in the rest of the country and a lot of the other states, but it's particularly acute in Vermont, partly because we have an older population, right? So a pretty big jump in that piece. So I think it's pretty clear that there's sort of more work to do to kind of fill those cracks. But the next slide, I just want to point out, we lost it.
Yeah.
We lost it. We got to look it up again. So if you just search Rotary again it's not in there. It's if you search Rotary. For some reason the file is hidden. It's hidden. Oh, but it's still up. It's in it. We cross it. If you search Rotary in that over here in that in that search bar there. Well, while we're looking for that, so yeah, if you search Rotary, you should find the folder and then it'll come back up. But while we're looking for that, the next slide is going to show you where the there we go. You never know what's going to happen. So the next slide shows you where the boomer population is. So I think there's a lot of conversation about the aging population of Vermont and where people are, but we just kind of wanted to point out that most boomers are now over 65, meaning that they're eligible for Medicare and they're eligible for Social Security. So you can sort of see where we are in that process. There's only in a few more years, all of the boomers will be above age 65 and eligible for the various programs. So the last one I want to show you in this section, and then I want to give a couple examples of what the state is doing, is sort of how I would sum up this whole picture, which is the wage and cost problem combined. So this slide is really looking at that green line there is the US average for prices and wages. And what you can see is that Vermont's prices, which is the pink, I guess, are pretty average. We're pretty close to the US average, but our wages are low. So that mismatch is the problem. Again, a lot of these cost problems that we've been talking about, where the costs have gone up for food, housing, healthcare, those are true across the country. It's been true everywhere. But where we really want to focus is that ours is one of the biggest mismatches, right? So of all the states. So our wages are low relative to where our costs are. For a lot of places, they might have low wages, but they also have lower costs. And that's just less true in Vermont than it is in a lot of places. And that's a function of a couple of things, the wage piece of it. One is that for a lot of jobs in Vermont, for the same job, they pay more in other states, right? So Vermont pays less. But it's also true that as a small state, we just have fewer really high-paying jobs, right? You can imagine that CEOs in Massachusetts or whatever that kind of pull up that average. So, it's a mix of those two things, but it's been a pretty persistent problem for decades. So I want to go quickly through this next section and then make sure that we have a little time for questions, which is, this is really about where we want to focus on where state policy can make a big difference. A lot of our state budget is coming from the feds and they're telling, and it's for a specific purpose. But these are the sort of pieces of state policy that I think both sort of where we've made recent improvements and then where we've sort of fallen behind. And I want to give a quick example of each. So this is minimum wage. So we were one of the first states to adopt this policy of automatically increasing the minimum wage with inflation and having our own state minimum wage. And then adjusting it for inflation. So we did that started doing that way back in 2007. But since then, everybody else has sort of lapped us, right? All the other states in the area, except for New Hampshire, that keeps the federal minimum wage, which hasn't changed in decades. But so from being the top, now we're at the bottom of the New England states in terms of minimum wage. But an example of where we've actually made some real progress is the next slide, which is the child care subsidies piece. So I think probably you all heard about last year, there were big investments made in the child care sector to the tune of, $100 million a year. And we finally hit that federal target of where we wanted to be. So it's huge that we've gotten those subsidies up. I will say that there's still a lot of, I think, churn in the childcare sector in the sense that there was a big drop off in enrollment during the pandemic. We lost a lot of providers. It's still a challenge to kind of match the slots to the demand, both sort of geographically, and then it's also, childcare providers are also experiencing some of the staffing challenges. So making sure that kind of that matches both sort of geographically and the total supply matches the total demand, I think is still a work in progress, but getting those subsidies up is huge. And not only are the subsidies up, but the subsidies are now open to many more families, and that will continue to grow. So the next slide is the picture of the whole state budget, and it's a little hard to see here, but I think the main thing to know is the total state budget, $8.6 billion. A third of that is education, a third of that is healthcare, and then a third of that is everything else, right? So, and I think one thing that's worth noting is this sort of a mix of federal and state dollars, what goes through the state budget. The federal piece is about $3 billion, and the state piece is about $5.5. And again, sort of the federal dollars come to us with a purpose, so we have less control or flexibility with those dollars. But so we have more control over the state dollars. But and healthcare is basically 2/3 federal dollars. A lot of this is Medicaid and Medicare and sort of these other pieces. And then public education is almost entirely state dollars. So there's really sort of a mix of things happening. And then all those other pieces are also a mix of federal and state dollars, tend to be, right? Some programs rely more on federal dollars than others. But the two slices I want to call your attention to are those sort of reddish orangish slices, the housing and what we call the individual well-being supports, which includes all sort of the things I've been talking about, cash assistance, food programs, childcare subsidies, all those pieces. So those two pieces combined are about 10% of the state budget. So a relatively small slice of what we do as a state. But that's really what we think about when we're talking about economic security tools. So I think, the bad news is sort of what we're showing in this report and what we've been showing in this report for a while is that we're not doing enough, right, in a lot of these areas. But I think the good news about that is because it's a relatively small slice of the state budget, these sort of reasonable targeted investments can make a real immediate difference pretty quickly. And then the last one I'll show you, and again, you'll see these are all draft. Again, they're fact checked, but not quite final. Is really thinking about how we know we have the resources. And a lot of that is because we continue to see this sort of increasing income and wealth inequality, even while there's a lot of Vermonters who can't afford their basic needs. So I want just to put that in perspective, right? If the incomes of the bottom 99% had grown as fast as the incomes of the 1% in the last 20 years, we'd all have about $100,000 more a year, right? So real difference in what we're talking about in terms of the kind of compounding effect of inequality. So just to wrap up, and I'm happy, like I said, happy to take questions or have a conversation. When we've been thinking about these promises, we've sort of been thinking about them in kind of like two categories, right? On some of these promises as a state, we sort of go all in, like public education, it's for everybody, right? I know there's a lot of sort of ups and downs with public education and the cost of it, but you know, it's a huge program, we do it all. But with some of these other promises, like the food piece and the housing piece, we really approach it like we're trying to do the bare minimum, right? Just giving people enough to survive, if that. And I think we're designing those policies based on sort of concern that we either give too much or that we give it to the wrong person. And it's really based on sort of keeping people out and not necessarily based on acknowledging the real cost of meeting people's needs. And sometimes those limits are tied to sort of individual eligibility criteria. And sometimes it's more like with the housing limits where it's just the state decides this is how much we're going to spend on this program. And that's the ceiling, right? And sometimes we just don't keep up with inflation so that the programs don't do what they were originally intended to do over time. They sort of lose ground over time. So from our perspective, you know, we have the resources to keep all these promises. We know that there's a cost and a wage problem. We know we've made some progress, but there's more to do. And we know we have the resources to make it happen and make sure that the state is affordable for everyone. So with that, happy to take questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please.
So, a lot of slides that you had, one was on obviously housing and you talked about demand. And it looks like in 2013, and this is a nationwide problem. Why has the country as a whole they must have seen the demand and now the demand's kind of out of control. Well, why was there no investment at either state or national level?
I feel like that's the most common question we've gotten about housing, like how do we let it get this bad and why are we in this position? I will say, so, you know, I think there's a lot of factors. I think post-Great Recession, there was a real slowdown in the construction industry. It took them a long time to sort of get back, both sort of staffing wise and funding wise. Obviously, since the pandemic, we've also seen a lot of materials cost increases. Again, that worker shortage is applying. But it's a great question. I think a lot of housing policy is local, zoning policy is local. So it's less something that is necessarily going to happen at the federal level, although obviously we've seen like, you know, public housing at the federal level happen before. But I think it's worth just kind of noting the places why it's particularly acute in Vermont, right? I think it is a problem nationwide, but there's pockets in Vermont where it's particularly acute, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is zoning policy is definitely part of it. The other is we have one of the largest share of vacation and seasonal homes. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that we could repurpose those homes, it just sort of leaves fewer options for building more places, right? So it's us in Maine who sort of have the largest proportion of seasonal / second vacation homes, right? And that piece is growing. That's not something we shared, but it is in the report that the share of sort of short-term like Airbnb type rentals is growing and particularly an issue in a lot of places. Another is the housing stock is much older in Vermont. I mean, again, we're just one of the older states, so we have more housing going offline each year than a lot of states as a proportion because so much of the housing stock is old. Then you add in something like the 2023 floods, which took out about 300 units permanently, damaged them permanently. So not a huge number, but then another 1,300 are sort of temporarily under, needed repair. And so that climate change piece, and then that also changes the piece. There's a whole bunch of sort of, as we think about the flood maps and the floodplains, those are there might not be an official update to those, but I think there's a lot of concern about where we build and how we build and what that's gonna look like, recognizing that climate change is here and that changes what we're able to do. So, I mean, I don't have a great answer of why we didn't do more sooner, but I think, there's definitely contributing factors that make it worse here.
Well, another one is transportation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people need to get to jobs and schools.
Yeah.
And if you build where they can't do that, our transportation system is not very broad or deep.
Yeah, one of the challenges of the rural state is the public transportation system for sure.
Going back to the wages, I was actually surprised to see that we've fallen, behind all the New England states now. Is there a correlation between raising the minimum wage and then raising wages for other jobs, like middle class jobs or middle management jobs, that sort of thing?
Great question. So to a point is the answer, right? So part of what happens, what we've seen a lot with the minimum wage is that it does sort of shift, but it tends to compress too, right? So there's both sort of an upward shift, but then it's sort of a compression. We don't necessarily see everybody shift up, but we just see sort of the bottom lifted up, which I think is a worthwhile endeavor, right, for the minimum wage policy, but it doesn't necessarily change the average wage. But when you look at that chart, just to be clear, so that compared to the US average wage over time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that wages aren't growing. It just means that they're growing at about the same pace as the US, and so we're not closing the gap anymore.
Let's see if this works. I'm not entirely sure how to ask this question. But you spend time in Montpelier. In the food shelf, we deal with a lot of assumptions. People make a lot of assumptions. And part of our job is to raise awareness. In terms of allocating money, do you have a struggle to change a lot of people's assumptions? There are people who think that a lot of the people out there who are in need are lazy, aren't doing their work, could do better if they just try harder. These are not great examples, but it's kind of what we see. And it worries me that people who have money and organizations who have the ability to give money may not do so just because of these assumptions. How does that factor into the work that you do?
I appreciate that question. And were you at the Just Getting By screening in Williston, or one of the Just Getting By screenings? Yeah, okay, I feel like I saw you there, because I know the food shelf people, some of the food shelf people were there. So I don't know if people have seen that film, Beth O'Brien's Just Getting By documentary. It's about food and housing insecurity, and it's really well done, I think. And it covers sort of this period that we're talking about when people were being exited from shelter. But all that to say, I think that is like a big part of our work is the critique of how these programs are designed, which is really about keeping people out and limiting. And I think we had some hope, and I think we still do have some hope that the pandemic made it clear that everybody needs help sometime, like that we could really sort of capitalize on that notion. But I do think that's right. I think a lot of these policies are designed sort of to be suspicious of the people that they're serving, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've been thinking a lot about sort of what does universalism look like? We worked with Hunger Free Vermont on the Universal School Meals campaign. And so I think it's really about, from our perspective, and we do a lot of work, a lot of the ways in which we sort of talking about individual issues here, but a lot of what we do and sort of contribute to the state policy ecosystem, I think, is on the revenue policy side, is on the tax policy side. So we want universal programs and we want a fair way to pay for them, right? So our job is to really push on the fair way to pay for them and push for universalism as much as possible. And part of what we've been thinking about, we've been working with a lot of partners on kind of a more coherent view of economic security, right? Just, we do have these programs and some of it's driven by federal criteria, right? The Fed set the criteria for some of the SNAP programs, the 3 Squares Vermont, some of these things. But states can also have the power to do more on some of these things and go beyond it. But we've been working more on sort of the flexible support piece, the cash support, so anti-poverty tax credits. Vermont put in place this child tax credit for tax year 2022. It's a good one, and sort of what does it look like to have more flexible support, recognizing that, you know, we still need sort of these targeted programs on food and housing too. So I think what we're trying to do is sort of push this more coherent vision of economic security. And a lot of it is, I didn't really talk about it, but Vermont also does something pretty unique, I think, in that we publish this basic needs budget or this livable wage report every 2 years. And so we are saying what it costs to afford your basic needs in Vermont. And so in my mind, all of our, that should be the roadmap. Like, I think it's one of those reports that maybe people look at and then sort of put on the shelf. And from our perspective, it should be actionable. That's the target. Like, minimum, afford your basic needs. We know what it costs. We know that there are huge gaps. And we know that most of our programs are based on more the poverty threshold, which the poverty threshold, the federal poverty threshold, are sort of laughably low, right? Relative to what it really costs to take care of a family. So our push is to really focus on the basic needs budget, that livable wage amount, as being the target through all of these different mechanisms, many of which need to be flexible support, and all of which sort of need to focus less on the screening people out criteria and more on the making sure everybody gets what they need angle of it. I mean, that's our hope. It's definitely an uphill conversation.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to tell you that, thank you so much, and in honor of your being here, we make a donation to the Williston Mentoring Program. And then also we have I'm gonna mix it up. We have our raffle tickets, so we're gonna put you on the spot and ask you to choose the winning raffle ticket, and you can just read the last three numbers.
Last three numbers. Okay, I'm gonna disappoint somebody.
Yeah.
980.
Oh, so close.
All right. Thank you so much.
Disappointed pretty much everybody.
Thank you so much, Steph. That was very insightful, lots of information to think about. All right, we're gonna move on to our inspiration. So Jen.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. She caught me, or her email caught me, just when I was home from traveling, and I said yes quickly, and then I didn't have the time I wanted to look for an inspiration. But I have a lot of Christmas books. I was going to bring one that called A Christmas Cup of Tea and read it to you, because it's a delightful story of a grandchild and a grand aunt, and it's very good for any time of the year, but you took up all my time, so I couldn't read. So I'm gonna read you a shorter story. It's The King and the Painting. There once was a king who offered a prize to the artist who would paint the best picture of peace. Many artists tried. The king looked at all the pictures, but there were only two he really liked, and he had to choose between them. One picture was of a calm lake. The lake was a perfect mirror, for peaceful, towering mountains were all around it. Overhead was a blue sky with fluffy white clouds. All who saw this picture thought it was the perfect picture of peace. The other picture had mountains too, but these were rugged and bare. Above was an angry sky from which rain fell and in which lightning played. Down the side of the mountain tumbled a foaming waterfall. This did not look peaceful at all, but when the king looked, he saw behind the waterfall a tiny bush growing in a crack in the rock. In the bush, a mother bird had built her nest. There, in the midst of rush of angry water, sat the mother bird on her nest in perfect peace. Which picture do you think won the prize? The king chose the second picture, explaining that peace does not mean being in a place where there is no noise, trouble, or turmoil. It means being in the midst of all those things and still feeling the serenity that is always in your heart. That is the real meaning of peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. All right, Armin, you wanted to
Sure.
say something?
Sure.
Okay. Rich too? All right, only Armin to ask, so.
First of all, I want to thank Chris for the Veterans Day, heading up to Veterans Day, and all of you that participated and attended. Thank you. I understand it was very successful. I also, the Scouts are involved in that, as you all know. They have a fundraiser coming up to pick up Christmas trees on January 6th. It's a Saturday. And I thought it'd be great if Rotary had a presence in that. It would help to promote our club to possibly future Rotarians. And I understand that Chris has also been in touch with the, excuse me, with the Girl Scouts, and hopefully we can bring them to the club, that form a relationship with them too. We're always looking for speakers for our speaking programs.
I have something to say afterwards.
Okay, and Ryla program, and just the energy that the young people would bring would be wonderful. So looking for a couple of pickups, trailers, whatever, to offer the Scouts on January 6th in the morning. It's morning, I'm not sure the time, 8:30 to noon or something. And they request a donation of $10 per tree that they pick up. So it is one of their major fundraisers. So I like that show of hands, people that might be willing to help us do that. I will do it, whether I'm the only one or not. Chris, thank you.
I get $5 per tree.
You talk to the Scouts. All right, thank you. Okay, so anyone else, if you change your mind, if your time opens up, let me know.
Armand, people are saying it's the 4th.
It's the 4th, Saturday the 4th.
I'm sorry.
Saturday's the 4th. Saturday is the 4th.
Uh,
And you said the 6th.
They're
It's
doing it
January.
before the wise men arrive on the 6th.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Okay, the 4th, it's on a Saturday. And Barbara wanted?
I need to
That's
say
enough,
something.
Barbara, for just a second.
Okay.
Okay. So, last night at 9 o'clock, I was thrown a potential lifeline. The, theater teacher at CVU said that she is going to try to corral some students. My question is twofold. I need to know who's in charge of January speakers.
You, right?
Yes, but we're all locked in. So you're locked in for the 16th? No, we reserved that for you. Right, but you couldn't possibly switch from the 30th, the person speaking on the 30th. That's Vince's person.
We can talk.
We can try. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send her the material today and she's going to speak to me. If we do have potential candidates, I'm going to give them the option. If they're prepared and ready on the 16th, we will go. If they're not prepared, I was going to give them an additional 2 weeks to the 30th. So can I be in touch with you?
Yeah.
Okay, that was my question. Fingers crossed, somebody will step forth, but as I said, she didn't respond to me till 9 o'clock last night, so we'll see.
Okay, I'm working on some Girl Scouts for that too, so keep me updated on the dates. Rick, you need a quick minute? All right, running out of time.
Thank you. The Toys for Kids program has drawn to a close for this year, and I want to start by thanking the club for its support of this program. And I have a certificate to present to our Madam President for the club's support. I also want to thank all the barrel monitors for monitoring your barrels over the course of the number of weeks we did this, and I don't know how many weeks it was, but anyway, I counted over 35 bags, and these are large bags of toys that were collected over the course of the period. And in addition, there was $750 worth of gift certificates that were also dropped off. And that doesn't count the number of bicycles and all kinds of other things that don't fit in bags. So I want to thank all of you for monitoring your barrels. And finally, I want to thank Howard for assisting me over the course of 2 days of dropping the barrels off and then yesterday picking them all up. We had a good time doing that. Thank you.
Great, another successful toy collecting season. With that, I am going to hand it over to Chris.
Good morning, everybody.